So just to give a bit of a context, when we're talking about climate change, most of the focus is rightly on how to prevent it, how to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. But we have to increasingly recognize that the chances of succeeding with that, or even succeeding of keeping warming below 2 degrees is not high. We may yet achieve it, but we've got to contemplate the consequences if we don't achieve it. And if we don't achieve it, what the science would say is that the world is likely to encounter a number of tipping points. And those tipping points will trip us into ultimately catastrophic levels of warming. So if the polar ice caps melt, as they are in the process of doing, then at the moment, because it's ice, they reflect back the sun's rays, but once they become water, they will absorb the sun's rays, and that will radically increase warming. If the tundra, which is frozen in areas like Russia, starts to melt, and it's already starting to melt, that will release enormous consequences of methane. And methane is a gas that's perhaps 40 times as potent as carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So there is a serious possibility that we won't make it in terms of preventing dangerous climate change, and that we will confront a world which is increasingly hostile to our species and many others. So that's what's prompted the development of the Deep Adaptation movement. That one feeling we need to come to terms with what will happen if we don't make it, if we have runaway warming. So what Deep Adaptation is it's a concept, it's an agenda, and increasingly it's an international social movement. So it presumes that extreme weather events and other impacts of climate change will disrupt food, water, shelter, power, and social and government systems. And it assumes that those disruptions are likely, or indeed may inevitably cause a societal collapse within a matter of a few decades. And the word deep in Deep Adaptation indicates that strong measures are required to adapt to what may well be the unraveling of Western industrial lifestyles. And I'll come on to this later, but the agenda includes a particular set of values, not least non-violence, compassion, curiosity, and respect, and a framework for constructive action. So let me just see if I can move on. So it's been popularized by a guy called Jim Bendall, who's a British academic and writer. But a paper he wrote about deep adaptation went viral and triggered a global debate, if you like, at least within the developed world, of all about recognizing the risk of societal collapse, the risk of economic catastrophe, and the question map of how we would navigate such a collapse. And Bendall concluded that there was a need to promote discussion about two things. One was collapse readiness, and the other was collapse transcendence. So collapse readiness, he says, includes the mental and material measures that we'll need to reduce disruption to human life. Now, we have to come to terms with the possibility that there won't be plentiful supplies of drinkable water, food, energy, health systems, and so on, and how we're going to come to terms with that. Collapse transcendence refers to the psychological and the spiritual and cultural shifts that might actually enable people to live in such a very changed world. with a degree of equanimity, even as we recognize that we're living in a situation that is substantially beyond our control. So that led him to building, with others, to building a framework for addressing those sorts of questions. And at the center of that are the 4 R's: resilience, building resilience, understanding the need to relinquish or relinquishment, restoration, and reconciliation. He says those values might well form a framework for a community dialogue about how we deal with deep adaptation. So, well, sorry, I think there's something probably I should just pause before we get that far. Just remind ourselves that, you know, we tend to think of our own civilization as one that's likely to go on forever. Things will be much the way they have been in the past. But of course, if we look back on human history, that's not the way it has been. There's been a whole pile of failed civilizations, from the Romans through to the Easter Islanders. And with most of those societal collapse, it's been a matter of a society that ultimately has failed to deal with complexity. Now, what did the Romans do? They built their empire and it went further and further away, and that meant longer, more complex supply chains and more difficulties in Rome actually controlling what was going on in far-flung places, and ultimately it became too complex and it collapsed in upon itself. You know, not being able to deal with complexity is a common problem of civilizations that can often lead to their collapse. And we may well be in a situation, we're already in a very complex society, but as things start to break down, we may not be able to deal with the collapse of complex systems. You know, just to take one simple example, we rely heavily on global supply chains and we rely heavily on just-in-time delivery. In Australia, just-in-time delivery has sometimes meant that we've had no more than about 3 days supply of diesel oil left. Now, diesel fuels a lot of, you know, not 90%, but a lot of agricultural production. If those supply chains break down, our agricultural system breaks down. So we, you know, the possibility of collapse may be much closer than we think. Anyway, with that as an aside, let's go back to the 4 R's. So the 4 R's means, first of all, building resilience, which is the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances and to survive with particular norms and behaviors. It means avoiding single points of failure. Now, if we rely purely on a fossil fuel-led power system, a single power system, that may collapse. And if it does, then there will be catastrophe throughout the system. We need to have multiple sources of power. We need to have multiple sources of water, and so on. So it also means ensuring that different functions can be fulfilled by different mechanisms, because we don't know which particular mechanisms will collapse at a particular point in time. And it may well involve localization. Now, we assume there'll be a central government, and the central government will, we might naively assume, will act in our interest. But you know, even if you look back on the bushfires of 2019-20, central government did not perform well. In fact, they performed abjectly badly. They ignored all the warnings of the severity of those fires. They ignored all the fire chiefs, and there was catastrophe in many places without central government being able to actually, for quite some time, restore the power system, you know, come back and remediate. So resilience is going to be one part of it, but so is relinquishment. That is to say, we're going to have to let go of a lot of things that we value. You know, we're going to have to let go of many consumer goods. We're going to have to withdraw from our coastlines. Ultimately, 90% of coastal cities will not be viable. Sea level rise is already locked in. It's not a theoretical possibility. We have already triggered the melting that will mean that many coastal cities will not be viable. It's going to mean shutting down vulnerable industrial facilities and giving up expectations about many types of consumption. So that's going to give rise to questions about, what's really important? What are the norms and behaviors that might allow us to survive? What's really crucial rather than what's disposable, if you like. Another concept that Bendel and others talk about is the concept of restoration. What can we bring about to help us with the coming, what will help us with the coming difficulties and tragedies? How can you get communities and people together to rediscover attitudes and approaches to life that have been eroded, that with heavy industrialization, we've forgotten about. We've forgotten about basic ways of making things, of mending things, and of conducting ourselves. And examples might include rewilding of landscapes, so they provide more ecological benefits, changing our diet to match the seasons, forgetting about imported goods because the global supply chains won't be there. Rediscovering non-electronically powered forms of play that may not be an internet, and increasing community levels of productivity and support. And the last of those values is that of reconciliation. We don't know whether our efforts will make a difference. We don't know to what extent we'll be able to preserve material possessions or our lifestyles. All of them may be heavily disrupted. So how can we reconcile with each other and with the predicament that we may now be living with? How can we avoid creating more harm by panicking? How could I make peace in a way to lessen suffering? How might we reconcile people with different political persuasions, religions, genders, and so on? Some of those being values that might be consistent with many forms of Buddhism. I don't want to go on for too long, but I'll just mention a couple of other things. Probably means relocalization. We're not going to have those centralized government organizations delivering our services. If we're going to survive, we're going to have to survive at a local level. We're not going to have the global supply chains. We're going to have to grow our own food much more closer to where we are, and we can't assume that it will travel long distances to get to us. So it's going to require local communities that collaborate, that roll out systems of cooperation between neighbours, that exchange goods and services, that develop perhaps their own local currency, that develop their own local forms of energy, and so on. And again, we cannot rely on the idea of central government. It may well not be there, or it may be simply looking after itself and not anybody else. Some would say that the one thing that would, I think I'll finish at this point, the one thing that would sustain us as a species might be love. Can we learn from the frailties of our own civilizations and the mistakes we've made in being acquisitive, in being self-centered, in discriminating, in exploiting, in engaging in violence, and so on? Can we reject those values and embrace much more basic, fundamental human values, not least the value of love, and of recognizing the suffering of others, realizing that we all suffer and that we're in this together, and perhaps we could get through it together. There's more, but I think that's probably enough. I'll make the PowerPoint available, and I've just provided a short list of references in the PowerPoint for anyone who's interested in tapping into this stuff, because there's There's a Deep Adaptation forum, which is very active. There are community action discussion groups within the forum, which are also very active. And more broadly, there's Joanna Macy's work on the work that Reconnects and on Active Hope. But I'm happy to have a discussion, but I think that's probably all that is helpful to say. How do I end screen sharing? I'm not quite sure, perhaps.
If you put your mouse up the very top, a little thing should appear, I think, or actually maybe the bottom, either the very top or the very bottom. There's a button. Got it.
Right, someone's done it. Thanks
for you.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was an awesome talk. I loved hearing it for the second time. I think I actually got more out of it the second time because I've thought about it in the meantime some more. I really appreciate you coming and doing that again. Giving the same talk that you already given in another group. So now we can open up to anybody who has any comments or questions. Yeah.
Eddie.
Neil, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the situation that we're in, sort of an economic system that is so contrary to everything that we need to do with deep adaptation. Yes. So we're kind of in an overdetermined situation. How do we deal with the reality of that, which will work very much against all of the wonderful requirements that we need to do with deep adaptation? So if you could just speak about
that's a very important question, which no one really knows the answer. I mean, I think we'll find out by experimentation as things start to unravel. The problem might be if we had a very gradual unraveling, then there might be time for that experimentation to take place, in a relatively without panic, without disasters all over the place. But if and we might learn enough to actually move, not smoothly, but gradually enough towards a different sort of form of living. But it's quite possible that there will be a collapse that's messy, that's ugly, that involves hundreds of millions of people being displaced, massive numbers of boats arriving on our shores and many other shores, collapse of parts of the global food system, because of course climate change is going to change, because it changes the weather, will make many crops non-viable, particularly if there's times of drought, or equally if there's times of flood. So we might well be in a situation where we have to make it up as we go along, where within a relatively short space of time, central government ceases to, collect our rubbish, provide drinkable water, maintain our security through a police force and perhaps an army and so on. In which case, none of us know the answers, but localization might be a partial answer. If your food chains have collapsed, if some of the forms of energy have collapsed, then people may well be left on their own resources, which means the extent to which they pull together as communities, and pool resources and share food and skills and so on might make a huge difference. It's a very good question. I don't have a better answer than that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you. I have heard some people say that in some ways a quicker collapse would be preferable, because with a slower collapse, one thing that the capitalist system is likely to do and is already doing will already be to get people into an us and them frame of mind so that people will become anti-immigration more forcefully.
Yeah.
And in a way that's priming the whole system to turn into something extremely horrible in terms of violence. And in a sense, if we have something more rapid happen in terms of methane release, for example, so that there's a very rapid kind of decline, although that makes the actual process of adaptation much more challenging, it might lessen the propensity of people, when there's scarcity, to become combative with each other.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, we may find out the answer to that question, but I think that's very plausible. You know, if it is a bit slower, then it may well lead to all sorts of really ugly reactions. One will be xenophobia, you know, will machine gun the refugees who attempt to come to our shore, being told by governments of the day that they're stealing our land, or all sorts of the usual horror stories. It would, if there's a slower collapse, then governments that have an inclination to be totalitarian, and it wouldn't take much, use the crisis as a justification for bringing in the army, declaring martial law, and looking after their interests and nobody else's. So there are a lot of really ugly scenarios in a more gradual collapse, and perhaps if it really did come quickly, they might be averted. Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Thank you.
I'm a bit conflicted, because one argument is you need to think much more locally and be much more focused on what's achievable within your local area. But you're at risk in doing that of actually forgetting about the global situation and just focusing on solving your local problem. So getting the balance right between trying to do what you can locally, but actually not forgetting that we're all one, connected, the whole world. And so I think we need leadership. So we can't just focus on how do we deal with this as individuals. There needs to be people coming forward who will actually provide a vision for where we might go next. And they're pretty thin on the ground at the moment, but there are some, and there is some hope, I guess, that in some areas there's a response that is taking us in a more positive direction than total global collapse. I mean, I cite the example of the state that I'm living in now, which is the only state in Germany which is led by a Green government. And there are things happening that indicate that not all governments focus on making the government work and forget about the rest. So I guess, especially to young people, I think there needs to be a balance between saying, yes, there's this potential catastrophe coming. In a way, COVID is a practice for that, because we are seeing civil society breaking down in places in response to this crisis. And it's a worry that that's happening when it's such a clear, to a thinking person, it's a clearly obvious thing able to be dealt with quite simply, but there's a deep resistance amongst some people to dealing with the crisis in a sensible way. So I don't know, my question is really, how do we get that balance right between doing something at the local level, which which does our little bit towards preventing the crisis, but also forcing our leaders or bringing leaders forward that actually can help us make more larger scale change.
Yeah. As you say, genuine leaders in this generation at least seem to be few and far between, although I have to acknowledge that Angela Merkel showed considerable moral leadership when it came to refugees at one time. You know, it might be a situation. Your question, I think, in part assumes or hopes that there might still be states and international agreements and coordination at international level, but it's quite plausible that in a crisis, all of that disintegrates quite rapidly, in which case there is no, there are no global agreements that are adhered to, there are no rules that are accepted internationally. I mean, I hope I'm wrong about that, but if a crisis really does lead to economic collapse, as it might well do, then it might drive a survivalist approach on the part of nations and indeed subparts of nations. And it might be that all that is left as a functioning unit, or that could be a functioning unit, is something that's much more devolved, that's much more local. Now, I guess much depends, we don't know. I guess much depends upon how the crisis unfolds and how rapid it is as to how governments deal with it. But it's hard to anticipate scenarios that will end well in terms of organizing things internationally, because it's likely to be I think there aren't too many win-wins going to be out there. There'll be massive levels of refugees, massive starvation, desperate people, and governments, insofar as they're still operating at central level, who may well be acting out of the self-interest of their people in turning away refugees, not any broader interest. And I hope I'm wrong on all of that. Claire.
I'm interested in, you were talking about that there's that element of letting go of beliefs and behaviors and reevaluating norms and those sorts of things. And sort of wondering, I guess I'm particularly intrigued by that, of how do we help people do so? Because when, like we sort of alluded to before, when people are scared or unsure in uncertain situations, they hold on much more tightly to those beliefs that they have, or their habits and those sorts of things. And there are a lot of the things that we need to change. I guess, how do we create more of that unity and the assistance, like the preparedness to help people who've got a different perspective? And I don't know any of the answers, and I guess no one here probably does, but that's something that intrigues me, because I think that will be quite a challenge.
Yeah, I don't have answers either, but I mean, amongst possibilities are where there is a sense of community anyway, where, if you're talking about population of 5,000 people, and there are a lot of networks within that group and levels of trust, then there's a serious possibility that they would pull together and find things that are for the benefit of the community as a whole, because that will also be to their own benefit. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes said centuries ago, if you don't have government and so on, life is nasty, brutish, and short. None of us want life that's nasty, brutish, and short, and community may actually be one way of avoiding that. I'm sort of struck, in the bushfires a Tobago down in southern New South Wales, for example, which I know a little bit about, you know, the whole main street was wiped out. I mean, that community was really decimated. You know, it was a tragic thing. But out of the ashes of that, there's some lovely things that, you know, there's a community centre that's now running. The people who run it are doing it purely voluntarily. Nobody's being paid. They're finding ways of helping the people who lost their houses, who lost everything. You know, anyone who's got any spare, a chair, a table or whatever to donate, it goes to somebody else who doesn't have a table or a chair. And it's actually, and having had a little bit to do with, or observing from the sideline some of that, it's quite, you know, humanity is, there are some wonderful virtues that we have as well as a dark side. And sometimes catastrophe brings out the good in people, not just the dark side. So I think there's hope in that, but none of us quite know how it's going to play out.
I have a question more about that building community. I'm wondering about, in terms of acting local, that implies a high level of connectivity with the people around you. And I mean, local doesn't just mean like your immediate neighbors. I mean, it can mean like in a whole
Sure.
city, potentially. But I was wondering if you had anything to add about the actual practical process of building community and what it actually looks like to do that local action.
Yeah, it's another good question. I have no background in that, but I'm a member of a very active community group and it's just interesting how when there's a cause that people feel strongly about, then often they do get together and, at least my limited experience, work substantially in harmony because they're passionate about that cause. And they're many different personalities. They've got different views about a number of other subjects, but by and large, they often move in the same direction. But I'm not sure how far you could generalize from that. I just don't have enough experience to say. It strikes me it will be much harder to develop or sustain a sense of community in cities and large towns that it would in, you know, small towns and rural communities, because the connectivity is likely to be greater. But even in parts of cities, there are organizations that pull people together, and community leaders do emerge in hard times. And, you know, there is still some hope. I think there's more hope for building sustainable communities than there is for hoping that central government will save us.
One thing that yeah, you go, Mum.
I think the focus would probably then, if you're right, Neil, be on building civil society in whatever way we can. Yeah. Because if we don't have that, then there's nothing there to sustain and recover. So regardless of whether the whole catastrophe actually happens to the extent that you fear, it's so important to build that civility. And perhaps one of the things that COVID has also shown is how necessary it is for humans to be connected to other humans in a physical way as well as an electronic way. And I think a lot of people have realised the value of that now because of the global catastrophe that we're facing at the moment, the very sort of personal one. And so I suppose you know, there are people who understand how to build community and civil society, and perhaps the deep adaptation people should be working with those people together to try and from the bottom end of the pointy triangle, try and build a much stronger base for our society.
Yeah, look, I have, none of us know the answers, but I have more faith that things could rise up from and succeed from the level of civil society than I do that top-down politicians will act in the public interest. When things get really bad. And if supply chains and road systems and communication starts to break down, then really a lot of stuff will have to happen at local level. Local communities will have to think, how do we safeguard the local water supply? How do we make sure we've got enough power? No, in the bushfires, what happened? The telecommunication towers went down. The water supply in some places got contaminated because there was no electrical power. The petrol stations couldn't pump petrol to cars, so traffic was at a standstill. So, things just, for a couple of weeks in some places, things just ground to a halt because we have this centralized system where we assume the electricity when you plug something is going to work, and when it doesn't, we assume you turn the tap and the water comes on, and when it doesn't, you have no idea what to do. So, sorry, that's not I don't have a better answer than that, but that's, I think there are better possibilities rising up from civil society than there are from central government. I guess that would be my bottom line.
I also wanted to add that I think that we each have more power in our personal lives than we feel that we have. I think we've been conditioned to have so much trust in large central government that a lot of us have never really had to depend on ourselves and our immediate communities. But I mean, the bushfires showed that people can remember that very quickly.
People stepped into those positions, local people. It wasn't central government. It certainly wasn't Scott Morrison going around trying to grab people's hands when he finally came back. Local people took the initiative, and leaders arose from the ashes who'd never thought of themselves as leaders, but they were and they are. And all communities will have those people. And the trust that will become necessary is probably best built up at local level, because you have the direct connection with people to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, I have the feeling that if a community needs a leader, one will emerge.
Yeah.
And Mum, if it ever happens, maybe you'll be that leader. I mean, you certainly have leadership experience. Maybe you don't need to worry so much about it getting solved in some other way, because maybe it'll turn out you have the skills to, I don't know, maybe you're building floods or something small. I mean, it would be big for you, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like, although I'm quite overwhelmed by it, when I sort of step back and look at the whole picture, when I come back to my own personal life, especially sort of the constant upheaval that I've experienced in my personal life, I have a fair amount of faith that things kind of work out in some way, even if bad things happen, it's something goes on, and there's some transformation.
And sometimes people respond really well to adversity. And there are some people in the middle who could go either way. They could become very selfish, or they could be drawn to some broader community thing, and which way they go will depend on the leadership within the community. I think at local level, sometimes some really good things will happen, but it's certainly not guaranteed, and it will depend upon individual communities. I should say, I mean, I think on the Deep Adaptation, on their, the website and the discussion groups, there's a lot of exploration of these sorts of issues going on for people who are interested. And I'll send the PowerPoint, but there's a reference at the end. If you're interested in that, it's very easy to access. So there is a lot of discussion about it. Yeah. But it's interesting that it's sort of, it's discussion below the surface. You'd never find a mainstream politician talking about the possibility of collapse or whatever. But there is this discussion nevertheless going on. Claire.
So that's sort of what I've been thinking about, of that, I guess, discussion and what are politicians saying, but also what's the media saying and what's the internet saying. Unfortunately, it's quite a powerful sort of source of information, and a lot of people form their opinions on things that they hear through popular media sources or through people's opinions on the internet. And that in some ways worries me, because sometimes it's very one-sided, or it's all about trying to create the drama rather than looking at the source of what's going on and what do we need as human society to get by and to survive. So I'm probably a bit more of a pessimist than I think you sound, as if you have been able to be, Miffanwi, of being able to step back and see the bigger picture and see the good. That's something that certainly concerns me. I know that in some ways the internet has been really wonderful. Huge amounts of money was raised with the bushfires. And a lot of people have come through for one another, even when they don't have that local proximity. But I know that there are the echo chambers in certain areas of the internet that are creating more of that us and them divide in many areas, which worries me.
And it's really hard to know how that will play out. I mean, I think people often do respond really well to adversity, and not from self-interest, but also sometimes they're looking for scapegoats, they're confused, they're frightened, and that's when they're vulnerable to sort of, toxic stuff that comes up on social media, and the othering, it's those other people cause the bushfires, or that, it's the immigrants, or it's the other, whoever the other might be. And it's so easy to play on that, I think. I don't know how that's going to play out. But sorry, just the last thing to say, Claire, is that the discussion that's going on, I guess, is from those people who've kind of thought it through to a certain extent and realized just the enormity of what we're confronting and are trying to think it through. But that's not a discussion that's happening in the pages of any of the newspapers, or even with the ABC and so on. It's just not percolated to that point yet. Yeah, I think it's too scary. I think for even say the ABC, it's kind of too scary to talk about, although be dismissed as extremist or scaremongers. So it's kind of, I'm not sure about this, it's speculation on my part, kind of a taboo subject, don't mention societal collapse, or that's woo-woo, or not sure. That will change.
I think we need to be more savvy about using the internet as a tool to get across the alternative ideas. I mean, we can hope Rupert Murdoch will die and his empire will die with him, but there's still Facebook. And, it's interesting because I use Facebook as a very positive tool. My feed is full of art and environmental stuff. I think it's possible to learn from how these influencers get their message across and convert people to these sort of really weird views, and you learn from them and use the same techniques for a much more positive outcome. And that's where the young people who are much more computer savvy than us old people can actually, I think, really do something positive, get the story. I mean, just, Greta, I remember when she was totally on her own in front of Parliament, and then from now she's just like leader of this huge global movement of young people, I must say I have a more positive view that I think that the world can, humans of the world can come together, as you know, as they did after other catastrophes like the Second World War. Not to say there won't be an environmental catastrophe, but that there is the capacity to rebuild, as you said, like with the fires. But getting the message across is probably at this point far more important than kind of trying to prophesize the future. And I don't know, I guess we need to hook up with more people who know how to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you know, within the so the Buddhist community, the work that Reconnects is one network, and Joanna Macy's related work on active hope, which you know you realize that Macy realizes awful things are likely to happen, but you don't give up. You still have hope, and you can still do really powerful things even in those circumstances. And so there is that sort of moral leadership out there. It's just not to be found in the pages of the Murdoch press. But whenever I go and hang out on the edge of a school kids demonstration, they're so impressive. You know, they're so articulate, they understand, they talk with passion. I'm blown away every time I go. So maybe the hope is there, you know, because that generation gets it, and they have the biggest stake, of course, in it as well. Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot, would our resident youngest person like to comment, Griffin? You don't have to, but
I don't know. Like all the stuff that's been talked about is certainly, especially with like the uses of social media, is something that I've been thinking a lot about in the past couple of months with the course that I took at uni. We did a project sort of focused around how do you effectively communicate these ideas and communicate with other people, and then put that on a social media platform in such a way that people are going to listen to it. And as much as, you know, using the tools of influencers to you know, for good as opposed to you know, conspiracy, as much as that sounds like a good idea, it's a much more complicated thing, because one of the things that gives those extremist views and those, you know, extremely sort of controversial and destructive views their power is their controversy, is their sort of the niche aspect of it, the sort of conspiracy sort of essence that they have, is that they are, you know, not a widely held view. And so it's a very, very difficult thing to communicate to masses and to change the minds of people on a large scale like that. It's something that I've found. Yeah.
And we have no idea how to control. Well, it's probably uncontrollable, social media. I mean, that's things go viral, which are completely false, but there's no real way of curbing their impact. And the perpetrators of those things are well aware of that. Yeah.
This reminds me of something we'd talked about a couple of weeks ago. I think Nettie was talking about like the importance of us all coming back to nature and seeing it for ourselves and watching it change, and that sort of grounding approach, which we've talked about a lot of. I think getting you back in touch with reality of what is around you. I think once you go onto the internet, you end up in sort of down a rabbit hole of different things, and it is that coming back to what's actually physical around us and seeing the changes for ourselves, and having enough of awareness to recognize that and to remember to notice those patterns and how they might be changing, because that's what then makes it much more real and tangible.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
also brings some relief as well for being able to appreciate the joy of how it currently is, and how much wealth of it brings to our lives.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that made me think about the farming community, which sort of senses that, you know, farmers increasingly realize things are happening with the climate, and there's fewer and fewer deniers. But there's then that's one thing, but then to get farmers to shift their farming methods to ways that are going to be not just more sustainable, but more resilient to a changing climate is much more difficult, you know, and it just takes a long time. And there are a few pioneers, and, you know, you can see the aerial photographs of their land compared to their neighbor's land, but it still takes another 10 years before the neighbors say, oh, maybe we should do what that guy's doing. But it is happening. Just the question, but is it happening fast enough? But yeah, thanks for the question.
Alex, would you like to add anything?
No, I think most of the things that I might have said have been already have been said. So, yeah, but I'd like to thank Neil for giving the talk. I really appreciate it, and it's been a lot of interesting things talked about, and a lot that I'd like to look up about deep adaptation and find out more. So yeah, thank you.
I'd just like to thank everyone. I've really enjoyed the discussion. Yeah, that's made me think about quite a lot of things that I probably need to sharpen up on. But yeah, so thank you. It's been really valuable, and lovely to meet you all online. Yeah, share this time. And I will send the the PowerPoint, and that will give yeah, some references to a few.
Well, I wanted to add one final thing. A lot of the discussion has sort of come back to we don't really know. I mean, that's
No,
sort of the end is like, that could happen, or this could happen, or that could work, or this could work. And there's this very famous phrase in Zen that not knowing is most intimate, which I find a wonderful idea, wonderful phrase. And so in Buddhism, there's the sort of the three poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance. And the opposite of greed is generosity, and the opposite of hatred is loving kindness. But the opposite of ignorance is not knowledge, but equanimity. And I really like that it's, you don't have to know everything. You don't need to have all the answers. It's the way you approach that not knowing. Being completely intimate with it and equanimous with that, and then acting from that position rather than the position of the ignorance that sort of feeds the greed and the hatred. You're acting from equanimity, which then feeds the generosity and the loving kindness. And that's just my understanding. Maybe you have a different approach, but I just keep thinking of that, you know, every time someone asks a question, you have a wonderful response, but also there's the I don't know, and I don't think that's a problem. I think that not knowing is where we need to be comfortable in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Can I add a fourth to that Buddhist, and that's wonder. To be able to look at things and with awe and wonder, and wonder why they are the way they are and how they might change. I think that's a really important value to bring to that group of three, because if you don't have that kind of hopeful sort of awesomeness before you, it's hard to know how to go forward. And so this is where art comes from, but it's just being in nature, as Claire said, that encouraging people to be actually part of their environment rather than onlookers. And I do say in Germany, there's a very interesting phenomenon. All the shops are closed on a Sunday. Everybody goes out to the forest on a Sunday because there's no shops open. And, you know, that's a really simple little thing to do if you think about it. And there's deep resistance to changing that, because then people would not go out in the forest on a Sunday. They would go shopping.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want to add one thing to that. Stephen Batchelor, who's a contemporary Buddhist teacher, says, isn't it amazing that there's anything here at all? You know, that we're here, that the trees out there, that the birds are out there. Isn't it just amazing that there's anything? And if we embraced each day with that attitude of, you know, you draw back the curtains, gosh, isn't this amazing? It might color our whole perspective for the day, much the same way as going out, you know, on a Sunday into the forest. I think that's probably where I should finish and shut up.
That's a wonderful place to. Oh, Claire, you've got. Yeah.
So I just wanted to thank you, Neil, for introducing me to Deep Adaptation. I hadn't heard of it before, and I often get very overwhelmed and snowed under in that feeling of uncertainty and not knowing, and wanting more information and finding it frustrating not having all of it. But I think this is a really nice framework to sort of help guide me to actually take action and face it rather than hide away. So thank you.
Good. No, my privilege. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Okay, everyone. So
Yeah. All right. I think we should wrap up. Thank you so much, Neil. That
no,
was amazing.
I'm very pleased to have done this, and I really, really enjoyed the conversation. It was lovely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wish your group all the very best. May you
Thank you.
flourish in many ways.